Hello.
Hello. Not so many people today. I guess we need to wait for a few minutes because when we were discussing the second chapter and you were out of office, I remember that people joined a bit later.
Okay. How do you like the book club so far? It's my first one, so I don't know if it's a good book club or not.
It's my first one as well, but like my goal was mostly to actually finish reading because I've already started to read it.
Yeah.
So
Same for me. Like for me, this is like group pressure.
Yeah. So you'll need to read it at least one chapter a week. So
exactly. I don't want to become unprepared like this. I don't want to be unprepared. So that's the group pressure I now have every week to finish a chapter.
Yeah, that's right. Hi, Eric. Are you also reading this book, or just like all you have you read it in the past?
We can't hear your audio.
Mute. Yeah, you're mute. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it should work now. I read the book a couple of years ago. I'm not actively reading it right now.
So when you were reading it, so how do you find it?
Let's see. It's been a while. I think I sort of skimmed through it. Like I didn't read it like start to finish. Overall, I thought it was a decent book. There were a couple of chapters here and there where I felt like they sort of threw things in without really explaining them properly. But it's a bit of a recurring thing with these kind of books. They're usually written by people that already have a deep understanding, and as such, they might overlook things that are important to those who don't have the understanding. But yeah, overall, I believe I quite enjoyed the book.
What would you recommend right now to, sorry to Tanya that I interrupted, what would you recommend right now as either Ruby or Rails book for like advanced that you, or something that you found super interesting recent years that enhanced your knowledge in that area?
Ruby Rails specifically, I don't know. Apart from this book, I never really read any Ruby or Rails books. For Ruby, I've always kind of felt the book quality was a little eh. The books from Sandy Metz are generally quite nice, but they're usually quite sort of specific. Like they're not these sort of general books about how is Ruby implemented or how do compilers work. It's more like here's a set of patterns with whatever. And I can give some recommendation like specific topics for garbage collectors. The Garbage Collection Handbook is probably the best one. Let me get it if I can reach it. It's my oh, fuck, hold on. Sorry, my headphones keep me on a sort of a leash, and it's like my books are just out of range. Yeah, so Garbage Collection Handbook, second edition to be particular. Great book, covers pretty much everything there is about garbage collectors. It's not a book you read from start to finish. It's more like a reference guide. But it's an excellent book. I wish more computer science books were like this, because most of them are, frankly, not that good. Like I have a bunch on, I have 2 on compilers in specific, and then 1 about like implementing programming language patterns or whatever it was. But they, the compiler books, they always dedicate like the first quarter or something to parsing, and they never introduce something new. So once you've bought one book, you can basically skip a third of all the other books. And then they usually start with like topics that either A, people don't use anymore, they stopped using it like 20 years ago, or B, it's just not that useful. And then the important parts, let's say type checking and that sort of thing, they just skim over that, like, oh yeah, you can do that, but yeah, blah, done. So I bought 2 books, 2 quite expensive ones, and they both were kind of the same, and I was kind of bummed out by that. There's some other more high-level books that are so-and-so. Fortunately, the quality is a bit of a hit and miss in that sense. I have a book also called it's called Mastering Application Development with PostgreSQL, I think. And I thought, oh, okay, because it said, we have examples about Ruby and Rails and Django and whatever. And I bought that thinking, oh, that might be a good book we can recommend to people at GitLab. Well, basically, the book dedicates like 1 page to Django and Rails, and then everything else is just pure SQL queries, which is useful. And, there are more practical parts on how you can do things with PostgreSQL, but it's not application development. Like I felt a little bit misled by the title.
So
I can't tell you which books to avoid, specifically the Dragon book. Avoid those, or the Dragon books, because there's 2 editions. It's like that thick of a book, and it's basically meant as sort of course material that you do over a couple of years. But it's, 1, it's quite old at this point, and 2, it's way too dense. Like they throw everything at you, and there's just much better out there.
So what would you recommend for application development? I'm now thinking, because I'm currently doing interviews again, I'm thinking through what are the things that we look for in candidates that you get by reading a book and not just experience, because for example, scaling issues or migration issues that we discuss, that's something I got by experience, I experienced them unfortunately. And that's one way, of course, to learn, but how to advance there is something that I have not figured out to be formal. Beside, you don't learn it in computer science courses. You barely find it in books. So yeah.
I think books are useless for that. So I have a book about what's it called? Site reliability engineering from Google. It's a pretty well-known book,
I know.
At the time. And I read through it, and it's one of those books where there is useful advice, but you read it and it's it's sort of there, but it's not something you really know how to apply. It's kind of like you read cooking instructions. You're like, oh, okay, so I have to put this in this long in the oven, and then you do it, and everything goes wrong, because it turns out what the book doesn't say is sort of in what order and parallel. It's usually cut things, then do that, and you find out by doing it's hey, wait a minute, that actually doesn't work, because if I do it separate steps, then by the time I get to step 3, whatever I did in step 1 is now burning. And so with these books, I kind of found it similar. They can give you a certain amount of insight, but I don't think you can say, oh, people who've read that book, they will know this, or they are capable of doing that. We did that in the past, or years ago at GitLab, when I was doing interviewing. Some people had book-related questions too, what's the latest book you've read and why? I kind of hate those questions, because they sort of bias towards the expectation of people reading books. So somebody, in other words, the interviewer likes reading books, so they ask people, what books do you read? If people don't read books, then they sort of immediately, I wouldn't say necessarily score worse on the test, but it's kind of and when they do read books, I find it doesn't say that much. I think just in general, what is it called? The Pragmatic Programmer is a decent book. And the initial edition is a little outdated at this point, but they recently published a second edition. I haven't read that one yet. but that is generally a quite well-regarded book. I think in that sense, I was always more interested in what people were doing outside of work, opposed to what books they read, things like that. And that's just mostly to see, like, okay, besides this person being technically capable, are they actually nice to talk to? Because as silly as it sounds, that's an important aspect of development. Like, you talk to people, and if somebody's life is basically work and that's it, I don't know. I personally don't really like working with people like that.
Yeah, I get where you come from. Yeah.
I actually thinking about reading Well-Grounded Truthist because Catherine Owen once recommended it. I'm not sure what this book is about, but she recommended it and I want to read it now.
I haven't read it, but Katrina Owens is generally well respected, similar to Sandy Metz. But the books, for example, Sandy Metz puts out, they're not really my type of book, because I look at it as like, oh yeah, this is all reasonable. What's the point? But she's at a level where at least I, and I suspect many others, will just consider whatever she puts out as good. Like, I mean, a lot of the stuff she writes just straight up is good. And Katrina Owens, I think, falls in a similar category, where it's good stuff. Let me see if maybe I have some recommendations. No, the Garbage Collection Handbook is the only one I would absolutely recommend anybody who wants to learn anything about garbage collectors.
But how do you think, is it like, if I read it, does it change my work approach? Like, make it me better in my work, or just like some theory that like grounds?
Right. So the book is a bit more focused on implementing garbage collectors. So if you're just a regular developer and you want to know how the Ruby garbage collector works, you can probably learn a lot from this book, but it's, I think, a bit overkill because it teaches way more than just that. So if you want to tune the garbage collector, probably just use some blog post. But if you understand, okay, now how do these things work, and how does the code I write perhaps influence that, and vice versa, I think this book in general is great. Like, it covers up until 2011, because that's when the book was released. It covers basically every algorithm there is, all the trade-offs, pros and cons. It has code examples of pretty much every algorithm. It's sort of like pseudocode, but they explain the semantics of it, and it's quite readable. It links to all sorts of other papers that you can then read up about. It has a whole bunch of topics, chapters on sort of the more application side. There's a whole section on finalizers and how that sort of fits in different languages and sort of when it works and when it doesn't. So it is, very helpful if you want to go sort of more low level. But I don't think reading it would sort of immediately make you a better Ruby developer. I think if you do that, probably your head would explode because it's like 800 pages or something. It's quite a big book. So it's more for those who want to how do these damn things work.
Okay, I understand. So should we go to discussing?
Yeah, formally start.
Yeah.
It was not that much in this chapter that was interesting. So, I mean, that it uses a branch unless as default to do the jump instead of should it branch or not, makes little sense. Which was interesting to me was like this break and return being like the same implementation wise in the end, and using throw, which I guess then also throw is doing a throw in the end, right? So interesting that this is not a good programming practice then in the end. to use throw everywhere. Like if you read the throw, it's always like, oh, and I'm not sure, like Tatiana, because you also read it, there was this puts add to where they provide the hash. And I mean, there's like a space between. This might be the issue, but it didn't explain why it's not using the hash that we provide as the numbers. Have you found it?
It's on page 99, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Oh, wait, for me it's 100, but.
So it's a beginning, like it's a listing 4.9 or 4.8. Because
for 2, it's exploring how Ruby implements keyword arguments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I somehow maybe I just slipped through this page, but let me just find it quickly. Yeah, it looks like there is explanation in the text for it, but when I'm reading it, I don't really understand what's going on. Yeah, probably. Yeah, it's probably like because of the space when it's parsed, so it's expecting to like get the bracket, like get argument, but it don't. So that's why it's used this default keyword params. It's my understanding.
What you're talking about. This is the code, and as you can see here, there's a space in between, which is therefore not compiling correctly. But
yeah, that's a parsing issue. So the Ruby tokenizer is, I think, a little unique in that it produces separate tokens for spaces, whereas I think a lot of parsers will just straight up ignore them, which means that Ruby knows the difference between foo space parentheses and foo parentheses, whereas a lot of languages, they cannot distinguish between the two. So what it's essentially doing here is, it's a little, I would imagine that probably the parenthesis becomes a hash. Is that correct? Wait, hold on. It is a little funny because I would actually expect that to be an error, but let's see what it is. Yeah, because if you assign that, it's a straight up a syntax error. Let's see what the arguments are. Let me figure that out. Yeah.
So, I mean, I get why I don't get why he wants to show a syntax error. Like I didn't see what he was trying to explain there. So probably what you just said, it's not compiling correctly and or tokenize it correctly.
Yeah, from my understanding, it's just like illustrations that like when there is keyword arguments, we'll get this local table with default hash. And if we don't provide any arguments, so you just like take the values there from this local table. And when we like get this space, it's treated like a method without arguments, so it uses default values, and that's all.
I mean, if we remove the parentheses, that's what he probably wants to explain. Because now it put as like 2, which is fine again. So yeah, this was just like I didn't follow along what he wanted to explain there exactly.
Yeah, probably it worked in the early version of Ruby too.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. And I actually had the problems with listing 4, 6 with 5 argument types. If you can, Nicholas, if you have it like digital, can you post it into the agenda? Because I just really I spent a few minutes trying to understand how actually actually it's listing 4 or 5. So they actually call in this 5 argument types function method and passing the block.
Oh, so this, here's it, the 5 argument types, yeah. I will just post a screen. Yeah, I will post a screenshot. It's a bit nicer to read.
Yeah.
So second page again.
Yeah. So I just from my point, from my understanding, that there will be a parsing error because we are passing arguments here. And after this 6, we have this parenthesis, meaning the end of the arguments. And then we have a block, which is treated as this argument D.
I was actually fascinated as well that this works and Ruby is smart enough to split it up in the arguments. Like if you look at it from the back, it's like, okay, it's the last one is a block. It's okay. So the C must be 6. And then the B, okay, B is optional, but it's provided. And it knows that this is like B, it assumes that in the first one, and then the rest must be this array.
Yeah, cool. But still, it still looks a bit ridiculous, frankly, because it's not when you actually read there, from the point of view of the reader, it's not clear what's going on in this.
I agree. So, yeah.
Yeah.
That's not an API you want to use.
I think Ruby is unique in this regard, where most other languages that have variable arguments, they require that they are the last one. And it might just straight up be a syntax error if you put any other arguments after them. But this kind of comes down to Ruby basically doing everything. It's like, oh, you want to do it this way? Right, you can do that. You want to do it that way? You can also do that.
Actually, on the weekend, I found some the article, I was going through the documents that I have and actually find one interesting articles about that why Ruby have all this different ways to do the same things. You can have size, count, and many stuff similar. And this actually happens from the fact that Japanese language is it's a built-in feature in Japanese language. They have a lot of synonyms and they use it all the time. So probably when the Ruby was designed, Mats wanted to have the same feature or had the same mindset as Japanese language. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the cultural aspect plays a role, perhaps in that sense. I suspect part of it might also be the case that the maintainers of Ruby just don't say no often enough. Regardless of what the reason is, doesn't matter whether that's cultural or something else. But this is something we see, for example, newer languages where people have a very sort of strict idea of what they want that language to be. And they just say, oh, yeah, this falls within the scope, and that doesn't, too bad. Whereas with Ruby, it's always been more like, oh, this is a nice idea. Let's see how we can incorporate that, regardless of whether we should. It's, a bunch of examples over the years, but
so it's like JavaScript.
I think with JavaScript, it's more like we didn't have anything to begin with, so whatever. Like we don't even have a proper standard library. And I think with Ruby, it's more because Mats in the past has in various formats stated that for him, Ruby should be fun to write. And from that sort of point of view, I can see that because different people have different opinions on how things should be named, it wouldn't be fun if you constrict them to one particular approach, setting aside whether that's a good idea or not. And so it's, the people behind it, sort of their ideas definitely influenced this. And I think people not being able to make up their mind. Like people saying like, no, this should be called size. No, it should be called length. And,
Yeah, like beside the if put performance out of the scope, for me actually I like this, the way that have like the philosophy behind Ruby that we have like this, all the different things to have to express something. It's like, for me, it's kind of really beautiful, and what you can find in another languages, like common languages. But yeah, but I guess it's like a more complex question because it should work also fast. And when you get like a lot of different ways to do one things, it will be less fast.
Yeah, I think the best example there is like it generally works fine in Ruby, but if you throw Rails in the mix, you get these things where it's like, okay, I have a collection. Should I use size, length, count, or something else? Because if I do count, it's going to run a SQL query to do select count. If I do size or length, it's going to load the whole thing into memory and count it in Ruby. And that's kind of where these kind of things bite you. I think we actually have a cop these days that says, hey, don't use size or length or whatever it is, use this other thing instead. Or at least we had that for a while. Maybe that's gone. And that's where I think it would help to say, oh no, if you want the size of what it is currently, that is length, for example. And if you want to actually evaluate it, that's called count. And that's it. There's no distinction. But I think, naming there is part of an issue. And I think in this particular Rails example, you could have that even if there was no size alias. Like if you have length versus count, people might be like, okay, which one does what?
Yeah, I also remember like on some talk, someone actually get an example of the some Stack Overflow issue when people were arguing about performance of inject and map, or like, okay, some methods. And actually when we go to the Ruby guides, it's just like aliases. So they broke inside like just like one code running inside, but they have two different names, and people arguing about performance of this the method, but they just like basically the one thing. So yeah, it's just sometimes it's shoot the community in the leg when we like all this multiple stuff. But anyway, I think it's beautiful.
Oh yeah, it definitely has its pros and cons. It reminds me a bit of single quotes versus double quotes. Like they have very distinct purposes. And there's a few too many blog posts, in my opinion, focusing on the performance aspect of single quotes versus double quotes, which in Ruby is completely ridiculous because that's never going to be a bottleneck. Like maybe if you write like assembly and that's that sort of level, it might matter, but even then, probably it doesn't. Yeah, with these aliases, it's the same. And there's a lot of that. People like, oh, this is better, or there's other things better. Well, turns out it's the same thing.
Yeah. And also I have like the last question maybe you can help me understand from this book. So we have the branch unless, and this keyword is used for if-else cycles. Yeah, so this in the book it explains that it's like it's on purpose just to make it like run a bit faster, so like to make this jump calls looks nicer. But I just don't understand why we actually need branch if in this case. So from my understanding, it will be running only in the case of when we don't have this else cycle, else condition. Is it right?
Yeah, so generally, not just within Ruby, but in most programming languages, you typically have 3 jumps. You have just jump or go to, whatever you like to call it, and then jump if true, jump if false. Which ones are more commonly used depends a bit on the language. Like a jump if false would probably be more commonly used. If you have like a switch, for example, you would have your input, your first test, and then you would say, oh, jump if false to the next test. Jump if true, you could use it for like a next or a continue, although there you probably just use jump. Let me see if I can think of an example where it makes sense. Oh yeah, I have an actual case. What you could do if you have, and I don't think Ruby does it this way, but some languages might, where if you have optional arguments, what you would do is perform some kind of test to say, hey, did the user specify this argument? If so, jump over the code that will assign it its default value. In other words, jump if true, skip the whole thing. And if not, run the code that sets the default value and then run the normal code. That's one example. But it depends a bit on what sort of code the compiler produces. But I would say generally out of these 3, there's usually one that you'll use the most, and then the other 2 are kind of like used in very rare cases, basically.
Yeah, okay, it's kind of makes sense that like branch if it's not really common used, but we need it anyway for some kind of not edge cases, but some like rare situations.
Yeah, and from the performance part, like a not equal would theoretically be slower because it's essentially an equals followed by another equals. As in you do the initial comparison and then you say, oh, if that equals false. I think for most CPUs, they have a dedicated instruction for that anyway, if I remember correctly, so it doesn't really matter. I think it's just more about the sort of semantics of it.
The question is for the CPUs, CPUs have like a branching model that they predict. So maybe this helps them with the not statement, like the branch unless statement, but it's like just an idea.
Yeah, let me see quickly what it will produce. Just curious now. Compiling. Wait, hold on, I have errors. Output expected. Oh, of course, it's a Boolean, not a number that it returns. Let's see. So yeah, not equal. Oh, whoops. People are watching, so my typing goes to hell. Let's see. It actually produced the exact same code in both cases. If I disable optimizations. Oh no, wait, it is different. Just one letter difference. So in a quality check is a compare followed by set E, I guess set equals, and then a return. Not a quality check is compare set NE. which is not surprising that there's an instruction for it. I think more in case of an interpreter where you have that sort of interpreter overhead, maybe it matters, but I think it's more just about being able to sort of generate less code. Like be able to say, here's just a go to if not true instruction instead of the comparison equal and then go the opposite way. In other words, 1 versus 2 instructions.
Good. Anything else you want to cover? Great. Should we cancel next week because of the holidays coming up, or?
Yeah, we can remove it and pass to next week, or maybe 2 weeks, because it will be New Year or something like that. So yeah, if most of the people are out of office, so yeah, let's cancel it.
Good. Then thanks for that half coffee chat, half book club meeting. It was a pleasure for me. Have a nice day, nice rest of your week.
Yeah, it was great. So have a good day.
Thanks. Goodbye.